There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a house where someone is being controlled. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of a Sunday morning or a sleeping child. It is the silence of a woman who has learned, through very careful and painful repetition, that her voice costs too much to use. This is not a story about a superhero. There are no capes here, no dramatic music swelling at the right moment, no clean Hollywood ending where everything broken gets put back together by the end credits. This is a story about a real woman, a mother, a wife, a daughter, who spent years waiting for someone to notice what was happening inside the four walls of her home. A story about what happens when the person the world trusts to protect everyone else comes home and finds out that the people he loves most needed protection while he was gone. A story about rope, silence, a phone call that almost didn't happen, and a reckoning that nobody in that neighborhood saw coming. Her name was Melissa, and this is what they never showed you about women like her. She was 26 when she married Darren Cole. She remembers the dress. Off-white, not quite ivory, with buttons that ran all the way up the back like a ladder she had to climb just to get into it. Her mother cried at the ceremony. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes from genuine joy, and not the kind Melissa would learn later, the crying that comes from not knowing what to say because there is nothing left to say. Her father shook Darren's hand for a long time, the way older men do when they're trying to communicate something through grip pressure alone. Her sister threw birdseed because the venue didn't allow rice, and they thought birdseed was poetic. Darren was magnetic. That is the word she would use later, and she would use it the way people describe a force of nature. Not with admiration, but with acknowledgement that a magnet does not care what it pulls toward itself. He was funny in rooms full of people, the kind of funny that makes strangers feel like they've known him for years. He had opinions about everything and stated them with a confidence that Melissa, who had always been quiet in crowds, found electric. She mistook certainty for strength. She was 26. It is an easy mistake to make at 26. They moved into a house on Crestwood Drive in a suburb outside of Jacksonville, Florida, 14 months after the wedding. By then, she was pregnant with their first child, a boy they would name Joshua, and Darren had reenlisted. He was already a decorated operator by the time they married. 8 years in, multiple deployments, a chest full of the kind of commendations that made his recruiters look like proud uncles at Christmas. The Navy was not just his career. It was the architecture of his identity. He stood differently in uniform, breathed differently, and when he left for his next deployment 6 weeks after Joshua was born, Melissa stood in the driveway with a newborn against her chest and watched his truck disappear around the corner and understood, in a way she hadn't quite grasped before, that she was completely alone. She told herself that was fine. She was capable. She had a college degree in education, a strong work ethic, a mother who was only 4 hours away, and a neighborhood full of other military wives who understood the particular loneliness of the deployment cycle. She told herself all of this like a woman reciting a grocery list, methodical, convincing herself through repetition that she had everything she needed. What she did not have was Darren's brother, Raymond. Raymond Cole was 3 years younger than Darren and had spent most of his adult life orbiting his brother's reputation without ever managing to build one of his own. He had tried the military and washed out in basic. He had tried a series of jobs, warehouse work, a short stint driving trucks, a half-hearted attempt at community college, and none of them had taken root. What had taken root, stubbornly and with the kind of persistence that only failure seems to produce, was his resentment. Not of Darren, exactly, or not only Darren. Raymond's resentment was more diffuse than that, the low-grade hostility toward the general shape of a world that seemed to be handing things to other people while he stood just outside the window watching. When Darren deployed, Raymond offered to help. It seemed natural. It seemed kind. He lived 40 minutes away and had, as he put it, flexibility in his schedule, which was Raymond's way of saying he was between jobs again. He offered to come by twice a week to help with Joshua, to handle yard work, to be the male presence in the house that Darren worried about being absent from. Darren was grateful. Melissa was cautious in a way she couldn't fully articulate, a low hum of unease that she dismissed, because dismissing it seemed like the generous thing to do, the charitable thing, the thing a good sister-in-law would do. Raymond came twice a week, then 3 times. Then he had a key. She does not remember the exact moment she agreed to the key. That is the thing about the early stages of this kind of arrangement. The erosion is so gradual that you don't notice the ground changing beneath you until you're standing somewhere completely different from where you started and the path back is no longer visible. The key happened the way a lot of things happen with Raymond. He suggested it. She hesitated. He reframed her hesitation as unreasonableness. She second-guessed her own instincts. And then the key was on his keychain, and the conversation was over. His girlfriend, Tara, started coming with him. Tara was a small, sharp-eyed woman who laughed too loudly at things that were not funny and went quiet at things that were. She and Raymond operated as a unit in a way that Melissa found difficult to describe. Not like a couple exactly, but like two halves of a single strategy. Where Raymond was loud and declarative, Tara was watchful. Where Raymond used humor and bluster to manage a room, Tara used information. She was always gathering it, always taking note of where things were, what Melissa said, how Melissa responded to various pressures. Melissa would understand this later. At the time, she just found Tara vaguely exhausting. The control did not arrive wearing a name tag. It arrived as helpfulness, as concern, as a gradual, almost imperceptible restructuring of Melissa's daily life under the banner of family and practicality. Raymond started having opinions about how Joshua was being raised. Minor things at first, the kind of observations you could dismiss as well-meaning. The baby was up too late. The house was not clean enough. Melissa was spending too much time on the phone with her mother instead of focusing on things closer to home. Each observation came wrapped in enough genuine-sounding concern that Melissa found herself apologizing and adjusting and, gradually, without ever having agreed to it, living inside a set of rules she had never consented to follow. Darren called when he could. The calls were short. The nature of his deployment meant communication was irregular and always felt borrowed, like time stolen from some larger accounting. Melissa wanted to tell him things. She rehearsed conversations in the shower, standing under water that had gone lukewarm without her noticing, working through how she would explain the Raymond situation in a way that didn't sound like she was being petty or difficult or failing to appreciate the help. She never found the right framing. The words always came out either too small, making Raymond sound like a minor annoyance, or too large, making Melissa sound like she was exaggerating. She said nothing. She became very good at saying nothing. By the time Joshua was 8 months old, Melissa had stopped calling her mother as often. She told herself she was busy. She was busy, but busyness was not the reason. The reason was that Raymond had made it clear, in the steady, ambient way he made most things clear, that phone calls to Jacksonville felt like Melissa going around him, reporting on the household to an outside party, being disloyal to the family unit he and Tara had quietly installed themselves at the center of. She did not consciously register this as control. She registered it as an atmosphere. The atmosphere of the house had changed, and she was trying to breathe inside it. What happened in the 4th month of Darren's deployment is something Melissa has only described in full on 2 occasions. Once to a counselor and once in a written statement that she requested remain out of public record. What she has allowed to be known is this. Raymond and Tara's presence in the house shifted from frequent to constant. A financial arrangement was suggested, restructured, then quietly made non-negotiable. Melissa's access to the joint account, the one Darren's military pay deposited into, began to require Raymond's awareness, if not his explicit permission. She was not locked out. That would have been too obvious, too easy to name. She was just made to feel that spending required justification, and the person she justified it to was not her husband. She started keeping a notebook. It was a small spiral-bound thing she bought at a drugstore and hid behind a loose panel in the bathroom cabinet, behind a box of tampons she'd positioned like a barricade. Every night after Raymond and Tara left, and they always left eventually, which was the only mercy of that period, Melissa wrote down what had happened that day. Not in formal language, in the cramped, urgent shorthand of someone who needs to document reality because reality is being consistently undermined. Dates, quotes, small specific incidents that seemed minor in isolation and monstrous in accumulation. She did not know what she would do with a notebook. She was not, at that point, planning anything. She was just trying to hold onto the truth of her own experience, to keep it from dissolving under the steady pressure of Raymond's certainty that she was misinterpreting everything. Joshua learned to pull himself up to standing during this period. He did it for the first time against the living room couch on a Tuesday afternoon, with Melissa the only witness, and she cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in months. Not from sadness, but from the raw, physical love of watching a small person accomplish something impossible, and from the grief of knowing that Darren was not there to see it, and from the terrifying, clarifying knowledge that she would burn the house down before she let Raymond Cole have any claim on the boy, who had just taken his first grip on the world. That was the day something in Melissa changed. She did not have a plan yet, but she had a direction, and sometimes direction is all you need to start building the road under your feet as you walk it. The notebook got a second notebook. She started paying attention differently, not with the overwhelmed, reactive attention of someone trying to survive the present moment, but with the focused, cataloging attention of a woman who was no longer simply enduring. She noted patterns. She noted timelines. She noted the specific language Raymond used when he was establishing dominance versus the language he used when he felt he was losing ground, because he had both registers, and learning the difference between them was like learning to read weather. She became, quietly and without announcing it, a student of the situation she was trapped in. She also, for the first time, started thinking seriously about who she could call. Her mother was the obvious answer, and also the most complicated one. Her mother would panic. Her mother would want to come immediately, would want to call lawyers and police, and probably Darren's commanding officer would want to mobilize in every direction at once, and Melissa was not ready for that kind of noise. She needed someone who would listen before they acted. She needed someone who would believe her without requiring her to perform her own victimhood, to cry at the right moments, and use the right words, and make herself legible as a woman in danger rather than a woman who was simply, as Raymond would have put it, overreacting. She thought about the other women on the street, the military wives who waved from driveways and brought casseroles during the first weeks of deployment and then retreated back into their own survival. She had never gotten close enough to any of them to know who could be trusted with something like this. That was another thing the isolation had accomplished. It had not needed to physically remove her from the neighborhood. It had simply made authentic connection feel impossible from the inside. There was a woman named Grace who lived 3 houses down. She had a daughter about Joshua's age and a husband deployed with the Marines, and she jogged past Melissa's house every morning at 6:15 with the specific, determined energy of a person who is running from something internal. Melissa had waved. Grace had waved back. They had spoken perhaps 4 times in 8 months. On a Thursday morning in the 9th month of Darren's deployment, while Raymond was in the kitchen making coffee he had not been asked to make, and Tara was in the living room with Joshua in a way that made the back of Melissa's neck prickle, Melissa walked to the end of the driveway to check the mail. Grace jogged past. Melissa said, "Hey, Grace, do you have a second?" It was 4 words. 4 words that felt, in the moment she said them, like the most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life. More dangerous than the day she'd hidden the first notebook. More dangerous than the night she called her mother from the bathroom with the water running. 4 words that opened a crack in the wall she had been sealed inside. Grace slowed, stopped, looked at Melissa with the kind of attention that meant she had already noticed on some level that something was wrong, had probably noticed for a while, in the way neighbors notice things they haven't yet been given permission to name. "Yeah," Grace said. "I've got a second." Melissa checked over her shoulder. Raymond's car was still in the driveway. She looked at Grace and said quietly and very carefully, "I need you to know something is happening in my house. I'm not ready to talk about all of it yet, but I need someone to know." Grace did not flinch. She did not immediately offer solutions. She did not look at the house with alarm and then back at Melissa with the expression that says, "I had no idea," which would have made Melissa feel like a spectacle. She just nodded once, with the deliberate steadiness of someone who understood that the correct response to a confession like this was gravity, not performance. "Okay," Grace said. "I know. And when you're ready, I'm 3 houses down." Melissa went back inside. Raymond was still in the kitchen. Tara was singing something low and tuneless to Joshua. The house felt exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, which is the particular cruelty of situations like this. The inside of the crisis rarely matches the outside. The walls were the same color. The carpet was the same carpet. Joshua's toys were arranged with the same cheerful randomness on the living room floor. But something had shifted. Melissa had a witness. And witnesses change everything, even when they haven't witnessed anything yet. She went upstairs. She pulled the loose panel back from behind the tampon box. She took out the second notebook and uncapped her pen. At the top of a new page, she wrote the date. Then, she wrote, "Today I told someone." She looked at the words for a long time. Then, she closed the notebook, put it back behind the panel, pressed the panel into place, and went downstairs to make lunch for her son. She did not know that in 43 days, her husband was coming home. She did not know that Raymond knew this too. And she did not know what Raymond and Tara had already started planning for the week before Darren's return. But the notebook knew where to find her, and she knew where to find the notebook. And for the first time in 9 months, Melissa Cole felt something that was not quite hope. Hope seemed too bright and too fragile for what this was, but something older and more durable, something that lived underneath hope, that existed before hope was even a possibility. She felt like herself again, just for a moment, just a flicker. But that flicker, she would say later, was everything. The 43 days did not pass quietly. That was the thing about the final stretch before Darren's return. It should have felt like countdown, like relief accumulating in the calendar. Each day crossed off, bringing the house closer to something better. Instead, the atmosphere inside the walls on Crestwood Drive thickened. Raymond sensed something without being able to name it, which made him more volatile rather than less. Because men like Raymond Cole are not dangerous when they feel in control. They're dangerous when they feel it slipping. He started coming earlier in the mornings. 7 a.m. sometimes. 6:30 once on a Wednesday. Standing at the front door with 2 coffees from the gas station down the road, as though this were a perfectly natural hour to arrive at your sister-in-law's home uninvited. As though the expression on Melissa's face when she opened the door in her robe with Joshua on her hip was not a complete and total answer to the question of whether she wanted company. He handed her the coffee. She took it. Because you take the coffee. Because refusing the coffee becomes a confrontation, and a confrontation becomes a scene, and a scene becomes evidence that she was the one being difficult. Tara had started staying overnight. This was presented the way all new escalations were presented, as a practical matter. It was a long drive. Raymond had an early start the next day. The guest room was just sitting there. Each sentence was technically true in the way that a series of technically true sentences can construct an entirely false picture of a situation. The guest room was indeed just sitting there. Tara did indeed stay. And Melissa did indeed wake every morning now to the sound of someone else moving through her house, opening her refrigerator, making noise in her kitchen, as though the house on Crestwood Drive were a shared space, a communal arrangement that had simply always existed and which Melissa was somehow failing to appreciate. She had spoken to Grace 4 more times by this point. Each conversation was brief. Melissa was careful, even paranoid about Raymond noticing. She had learned his patterns well enough by now to know the precise window of time she had between when his attention turned inward to his phone, to the television, to whatever ambient grievance he was currently nursing, and when it swung back outward toward her. She had maybe 5 minutes, sometimes less. In those 5 minutes, she and Grace had built something that was, in its compressed, urgent way, a friendship, the kind that forms between people who have recognized each other through a common language that most of the world cannot hear. Grace had started writing things down too. Not her own experiences. Her situation at home was different, her loneliness more ordinary, but what she observed from 3 houses down. The times Raymond's car arrived, the length of time it stayed, the occasions when she could see, from her front window, the particular stiffness in Melissa's posture when she stood in her own driveway, the way a woman's body narrates what her mouth is not permitted to say. Grace was building a record. She had not been asked to do this. She just understood, instinctively and practically, that if something happened, and by this point she had moved past wondering if something would happen to simply waiting for when, there would need to be a record that existed outside of Melissa's bathroom cabinet. This is what women do for each other in situations like this. They witness. They document. They become each other's external memory when the environment inside the crisis works hard to convince you that your own memory is unreliable. 22 days before Darren's return, Raymond told Melissa that she needed to think carefully about what she planned to say to her husband when he came home. He said it in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, while Tara was in the living room with Joshua. He was standing by the window and not looking at her, which is how Raymond delivered the statements that mattered most. Not face-to-face, not with the direct confrontation that could be named and argued against, but sideways, ambient like a temperature change in a room that you couldn't point to a single source for. He said, Darren is going to be tired. He's going to be dealing with the adjustment. It's not a good time to put ideas in his head about things that were probably misunderstandings. She said, what ideas? He looked at her then, and the look was not threatening in any way that she could have described to a police officer. It was just a look. The look said, we both know exactly what ideas. And the look also said, I'm telling you, right now, in this kitchen on a Sunday morning, with your son 12 feet away, that there will be consequences for the ideas you choose to put in your husband's head. She held his gaze for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Would you like more coffee?" He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked away. "Sure," he said. She poured the coffee. Her hand did not shake. She was proud of this. She filed it away in the part of herself that was keeping score, that was measuring her own endurance and finding, to her own surprise, that it held. What Raymond did not know, could not have known, because Melissa had not told anyone except Grace, and Grace had not told anyone except her bathroom mirror, was that 3 days before this Sunday, Melissa had managed to send Darren an email. The email had taken her 11 drafts across 4 separate evenings. The problem was not finding the words. The problem was finding the words that would make him understand without triggering the particular kind of dismissal that military men sometimes apply to domestic concerns. The instinct to reframe civilian worry as disproportionate, to measure everything against the scale of what they have seen deployed and find the home front version lacking. She loved her husband. She also knew her husband. She knew the way his training shaped his perception of risk, the way he naturally calculated threat in terms of physical danger rather than the slow, erosive, psychological kind that leaves no visible marks. She did not write, "Raymond is controlling me." She wrote, "I need you to know that when you come home, some things need to change immediately. I can't explain everything over email, but I need you to trust me that what I'm going to tell you is true, and I need you to come home ready to hear it before Raymond or Tara get to you first." She stared at this for a long time. Then she added, "I kept a notebook. 2 notebooks. I have everything written down." She sent it 11:47 on a Thursday night, while Raymond and Tara were in the guest room and Joshua was asleep from her phone with the screen brightness turned all the way down, sitting in the dark in the bathroom where the only sound were the water heater clicking and her own careful breathing. Then she deleted the sent email. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep. The event that the street would later talk about happened on a Tuesday, 13 days before Darren's scheduled return. She has reconstructed the sequence carefully enough that she can narrate it without becoming lost in it, which is what she does now when she has to describe it. She uses the narration the way you use a handrail to keep herself upright through the geography of the memory. Raymond had come over in the afternoon. Tara had not come with him, which was notable. They almost always came together now, the two of them operating as a unit, Tara providing the soft edge to Raymond's harder one. Without Tara, Raymond's edges were unmediated. He had been drinking, she could tell. Not obviously, not in the way that turns someone into a stranger, but in a way that loosens the calibration between thought and speech, that removes a layer of social insulation. He was more direct, more aggressive in the low, ambient way that was his specialty. They argued. She will not characterize it as anything more dramatic than that, because drama is not what it was. It was ordinary in its ugliness. The kind of argument that unfolds in the middle of a weekday afternoon in a suburban kitchen while a toddler naps upstairs. The kind that makes no sound the neighbors can hear, but fills the room so completely there's no space left to breathe in. The argument was about the money. It was always, underneath everything else, about the money. Raymond had been using Darren's allotment, the family subsistence allowance, the BH, as though it were a household budget he managed rather than money that belonged to Darren and Melissa alone. He had been suggesting, then implying, then stating outright, that his presence in the house constituted a contribution that deserved acknowledgement of some financial kind. And on this Tuesday afternoon, 13 days before Darren came home, he decided that Melissa owed him a number. She said no, just no, nothing elaborated, no softening, no explaining, no offering an alternative framing that might let him save face. She had been building to this no for months without knowing it, and when arrived it came out clean and flat and absolute, the single syllable with no give in it. Something in Raymond's face changed. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and grabbed her wrist. Not with violence. This is a distinction she makes because it matters, because the law requires distinctions, because the absence of a bruise becomes evidence of a different kind. He grabbed her wrist the way you grab something you own, with the casual, entitling grip of someone who has decided that the question of what belongs to him is no longer a question. He squeezed once, not hard enough to hurt exactly, but hard enough to remind her that he could, and he looked at her and said, "Be careful." 2 words. She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at him. She pulled her arm back, and he let go, and she walked past him into the living room, and she picked up Joshua from the playmat where he'd been stacking blocks, and she held him against her chest, and she stood there with her back to Raymond until she heard him leave. The front door closed. She stood there a minute longer. Then she put Joshua down on the playmat. She went to the junk drawer in the kitchen. She took out a pen. She went to the back of a grocery receipt that was sitting on the counter, and she wrote down the time and the words and the 4 steps across the kitchen and the grip and be careful. And she put the receipt in her bra because she couldn't get to the notebook. And she had learned through the long education of this situation that you do not let anything go unrecorded, not even the things that feel like they might be too small to matter. She called Grace that afternoon. This time, it was not a 5-minute window conversation over a fence. This time she said, "Grace, I think I'm going to need help soon." And Grace said, "I've been ready." The next morning, Melissa went to her bank. She went to the branch 3 towns over, not the one Raymond had accompanied her to twice in the past 6 months, the one where the teller knew his name. She went to an unfamiliar branch, and she sat with a personal banker who had warm eyes and a calm demeanor, and she explained in as few words as possible that she needed a separate account. The banker asked no personal questions beyond what the form required. She did not explain herself further. She opened the account with $300 from a grocery envelope she had been building over 4 months in denominations small enough not to be noticed. Tens and 5 that she had quietly siphoned from the household cash with the patience and discipline of a woman who had decided that small acts of preparation were the only acts of resistance available to her. $300. Her own account. Her own access. She drove home, and she thought about the fact that Darren was coming back in 11 days, and she allowed herself, for the length of the drive, to feel something she had not let herself feel in almost a year. Not quite hope. Something next door to it. Something with a lock on it that only she had the key to. He called her 8 days before he landed. The connection was bad. It always was the satellite link dropping out every few minutes, his voice going digital and strange before it resolved back into itself. She stood in the backyard with Joshua on her hip, and the September sun cutting low through the trees at the back of the property, and she listened to her husband's voice traveling across whatever distance separated them, and she held very still. He said, "I got your email." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you okay right now at this exact moment?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Are Joshua and you safe?" She said, "For now." There was a pause that was partly the satellite delay and partly Darren doing what Darren did, which was process before speaking, sequence information in the way his training had optimized him to do, find the structure of a situation before he engaged with it. He said, "Tell me one thing, just one thing, so I understand the shape of it." She thought for a moment. Then she said, "He has a key to our house." Another pause. This one felt different. Felt like a door closing quietly in a room somewhere, the soft, final click of a decision being made. He said, "Okay, just that. Okay." She had expected more, expected questions, expected the particular kind of calibrating doubt that she had feared. Is this as serious as it sounds? Are you sure that let me talk to Raymond? She had prepared for those questions. She had spent 9 months preparing for those questions. He did not ask them. He said, "I'm going to need you to do one thing for me. When I come home, don't tell Raymond what day I'm landing. I don't want him to know the exact timeline." She felt something loosen in her chest. The particular physical release of being believed without needing to perform believing's criteria. It moved through her like something coming unclenched. She said, "Okay." He said, "You kept notebooks?" She said, "Too." He said, "Good." Joshua grabbed at her ear just then, his fat toddler fingers missing and catching her hair instead, and she laughed a real laugh, unplanned, the kind that doesn't need an audience, and Darren laughed too across the satellite static, and for 30 seconds they were just a husband and wife laughing at their son's chaos, ordinary, and alive in a way they had not been together for 9 months. Then the connection cut out. She stood in the yard with Joshua pulling her hair, and the trees throwing long shadows across the lawn, and the September sky going amber at the edges, and she understood that what was coming was not going to be clean or easy or the kind of resolution that lands neatly. But it was coming. 8 days. She went inside. She fed Joshua. She cooked dinner. She did the dishes. She checked the bathroom cabinet. Notebook still there, still safe, still full of every date and word and 4-step kitchen crossing and grocery receipt confession. She got into bed. Raymond's car was not in the driveway tonight. For the first time in weeks, she had the house to herself. She lay in the dark and listened to the specific silence of a house where only one person is breathing and thought about what 8 days could hold. She did not sleep much, but she slept. That was enough. That was new. 7 days. Darren Cole did not come home the way she had imagined. She had imagined it hundreds of times across the deployment, the way military wives do, constructing and reconstructing the homecoming the way you build something in your head to get through the day, a mental object you can hold and turn over in your hands when the alternative is thinking about all the things that could still go wrong. In her imagined version, he came through the airport arrival's door in uniform with his duffel over his shoulder, and Joshua ran to him on legs that were steadier than they actually were, and he scooped their son up and looked at her over the boy's head with everything that needed to be said passing between them in silence. The way people in movies communicate every decade of shared history through a single glance. He did not come through arrivals. He came through the front door at 6 in the morning, for days earlier than the date she had given Raymond, wearing civilian clothes and carrying only a backpack, and the first thing he did when he stepped into the house was stand very still in the hallway and listen. The way a man listens when he is calibrating a space for threat. The way years of training makes listening into something physical, something full-bodied, not just the ears but the whole posture. Then he looked at her. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in a gray early light with Joshua on her hip. The baby had woken at 5:30, as he did, with no regard for the emotional architecture of the morning, and she looked at her husband and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. There was only this. Him in the hallway, her in the doorway, and the house around them both, and the weight of all the months between. He crossed the hallway. He took Joshua first, held him the way a man holds a child he has been thinking about for 9 months, not gently, not carefully, but with the specific fierceness of someone who has been keeping love contained and is now finally allowed to release it. Joshua grabbed his ear. Darren laughed. The sound of it filled the house in a way it hadn't been filled in 9 months, a different resonance from the sounds Raymond and Tara made, something that belonged here rather than colonized it. Then he looked at Melissa over Joshua's head. She expected to cry. She had prepared herself to cry, had told herself it was fine to cry, that crying was the appropriate and human response to this moment. She did not cry. What she felt was not the thing that produces tears. It was the thing that comes after you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and the weight is finally redistributed, the thing that is not joy exactly, but is the physical relief of no longer bearing everything alone. She said, "You're early." He said, "For days." Raymond doesn't know. She nodded. He said, "I need to see the notebooks before anything else. Can you get them?" She went upstairs. She came back with both. She put them on the kitchen table, and Darren sat down with Joshua in his lap and opened the first notebook and read. He read the way she had written them, methodically, completely, without performing a reaction, without the running commentary of someone who needs to process out loud. He just read. She made coffee. She sat across from him. Joshua eventually climbed down and went to investigate his toys, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of pages turning and the coffee maker doing its work. He read for an hour and 20 minutes. When he finished the second notebook, he closed it and put it on top of the first and set them both aside, aligned evenly with the edge of the table in the particular way of a man who manages disorder through small physical acts of order. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at Melissa. He said, "How long have you been managing this alone?" She said, "Since the 2nd month." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." She had not expected that either. She had expected anger. And it was there. She could see it, sitting in him the way anger sits in someone with exceptional self-regulation, present and controlled the pressure behind a closed valve. But the first thing he said was sorry. Not to Raymond. To her. For the months she had carried alone what should never have been hers alone to carry. She said, "He has a key." Darren said, "Not after today." The lock change happened at 8 in the morning. He did it himself, from a kit he'd stopped to buy on the way from the airport, efficiently and without ceremony, kneeling at the front door and the back door with the quiet focus of someone who has done more technically demanding work in worse conditions than this. Melissa stood in the hallway with her coffee watching him, and something about the image, her husband on one knee, dismantling a small piece of the apparatus that had held her in place, replacing it with something Raymond could not access, made her breath go short in a way she hadn't expected. She thought about the grocery receipt in the junk drawer. the $300 in the new account, the 2 notebooks. She thought about all the small, painstaking acts of preparation she had made in the months when preparation was the only form of agency she had. He hadn't needed to rescue her. She had been building the rescue herself, piece by piece, in the dark. She had just needed him to come home and be the person who could make the pieces mean something in the open. He finished the locks. He stood up. He handed her both new keys. She took them. Then he picked up his phone and called Raymond. She stood close enough to hear. Not because he held the phone away from his ear for her benefit. He didn't. He held it the normal way, but the kitchen was quiet, and Raymond's voice was the kind that traveled. She heard the hello, the initial warmth, the way Raymond's voice went up slightly with the specific performance of a man who is genuinely surprised, but is also, below the surprise, instantly alert, instantly recalibrating. Darren's voice, by contrast, was completely flat. Not hostile, not raised. The flatness of someone who has decided that volume and emotion are inefficiencies in this particular operation. He said, "I need you to come over this morning." Raymond asked what time. Darren said now. A pause on Raymond's end. Then, the beginning of some conversational maneuver, some fraternal warmth being deployed. "Brother, it's early. Let me get cleaned up. I wasn't expecting you back yet. Why didn't you tell me you were landing?" Darren said. Raymond, "I need you to come now." He said it the same way twice. No inflexion sift. No explanation. Just the repetition of the sentence, as though repetition were its own sufficient argument. As though all Raymond needed to understand was that the sentence was not a request being decorated with politeness. Raymond said he'd be there in 45 minutes. He arrived in 32. She was not in the room when they talked. This is a choice she made clearly and intentionally, and she would make it again. She had been the only person in the room with Raymond for 9 months. She had held that space alone, had managed it and documented it and survived it on her own. She did not need to be in the room now. She did not need to watch Raymond's face while her husband dismantled him. That was not why she had written the notebooks. She had written the notebooks so that the truth would exist in a form that was legible to someone else, so that her experience would have a witness who could speak with authority. She had done her part of this. Now, she took Joshua outside to the backyard and sat in the September morning and let her son toddle across the grass, and she breathed. She could not hear them. The windows were closed. She did not want to hear them. What she knew, because Darren told her afterward, was this. Raymond arrived and was offered a seat and was not offered coffee, which was a choice, and then Darren placed both notebooks on the coffee table between them and told Raymond that he had read them in full this morning and that he would like Raymond to explain which entries were inaccurate. He did not ask Raymond whether the events had occurred. He did not frame it as a debate. He presented the notebooks as existing evidence and asked for specific corrections, which is a form of interrogation that offers no easy exits because it removes the option of wholesale denial and forces a person into the much harder territory of explaining individual incidents one by one. Raymond explained nothing. What Raymond did instead was attempt several different conversational exits, fraternal appeals, grievance-based counter-narratives, the suggestion that Melissa had a history of misinterpreting situations, the implication that Darren's absence had created a vacuum that Raymond had generously filled. Each of these exits closed in front of him, not because Darren shouted or threatened or performed outrage, but because Darren had read the notebooks and knew every specific detail and was therefore immune to the general, ambient undermining that had worked so effectively on Melissa when she was the only audience. Raymond finally said, "She was fine. Nothing happened to her. I was helping." Darren said, "Give me your key." Raymond said, Darren said, "The key, Raymond." There was a silence. Then, Raymond put the key on the coffee table. Darren picked it up. He said, "I'm going to need you and Tara to stay away from this house. I'm going to need you to stop accessing the family accounts. And I'm going to need you to understand that I read everything Melissa wrote. And if any of it happens again, we will not be having a conversation. We will be having a different kind of conversation in a room with other people present." Raymond left. The front door closed. Same sound as always. The ordinary sound of a door closing in a house on a suburban street on a Tuesday morning in September. Nothing cinematic about it. No score, no slow motion, no moment where the camera pulls back to show the enormity of what just happened against the scale of the neighborhood around it. Just a door. Just a click. Melissa heard it from the backyard. She looked up. She saw Darren's shape behind the sliding glass door, and then the door opened, and he came outside and sat down on the back steps and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the lawn for a moment, where Joshua was crouching down to examine something in the grass with the total absorption of a child discovering the universe one object at a time. She sat down next to him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said, "He's gone." She said, "Good." He said, "I should have been here." She said, "You were where you were supposed to be. I was where I was supposed to be. It's okay." He looked at her. The look was not relief, and it was not gratitude, and it was not the thing that comes after a crisis, the exhale of normalcy reasserting itself. It was something rawer than all of those things, something that sits underneath the organized, competent surface of a man who has built his entire identity around the capacity to manage danger, the thing that has no name in the language of military service, and therefore gets no training and no protocol. He said, "I read what he said about the money." She said, "I know." He said, "I read what he said in the kitchen." She said, "I know." He said, "You weren't supposed to have to." She put her hand on his arm. Just that. Not to stop him, not to comfort him, not to perform a particular emotional message. Just to make contact, the most basic human act, the original language beneath all the other languages they had developed to talk to each other. He stopped. Joshua stood up from whatever he'd been examining, turned around, and walked with his still not quite steady gait across the lawn toward them, his face arranged in the particular determined expression of a small person with a destination, and the absolute conviction that he will reach it. He made it to the steps. He grabbed Darren's knee with both hands. He said, "Dada." It was the first time. The first time he'd said it with his father present to hear it. Melissa looked at Darren's face when he heard it. The word landing in him, the 9 months of absence colliding with this single syllable. And she felt the thing she had not been able to cry earlier move through her now. Not as tears, but as something in the chest, some pressure releasing that she hadn't fully known was still there. She had waited. She had kept the notebooks and changed the account and told Grace and sent the email and changed nothing about her face when Raymond looked at her and counted the days on the calendar and waited. She had not waited for Superman. Superman was a fantasy, and fantasies don't come home 4 days early with a lock kit in a backpack. What had come home was a man who was tired and who had read her notebooks and who said, "I'm sorry," before he said anything else, and who had just heard his son say his name for the first time on the back steps of a house that was theirs again. Not a rescue, a return, not a hero, a husband. The difference between those two things is everything. She had learned the difference the hard way in the dark, in a bathroom, with a flashlight and a spiral notebook, and the stubborn, unglamorous determination of a woman who had decided, very quietly and very finally, that no one was coming to save her, and that she therefore had better get very good at saving herself while she waited for the person she loved to come back to the world she was keeping intact for both of them. She watched Joshua pull himself up onto Darren's lap with the same grip he'd used on the couch cushion 8 months ago, the first time he'd stood, that day when she had cried in a way that was love and grief mixed together into something without a clean name. The September morning sat around the three of them in the backyard, ordinary and golden and nothing like a movie. Exactly like life. That was the thing nobody told you about waiting. They talked about it like it was passive, like the person waiting was simply absent from the story, treading water until the real action arrived. But she had not been treading water. She had been building. Quietly, carefully, in the small available margins of every controlled and surveilled day, she had been building the thing that would matter when the moment came. The notebooks were still on a coffee table inside. She would need them. There were conversations still ahead, with a counselor, with a lawyer, with the military family support system that would need to understand what had happened in that house, with her mother, who was going to cry the bad kind and then the good kind. There was Raymond still existing 40 minutes away, and the low-level vigilance that would not dissolve immediately, the hyper-awareness that had been calibrated to his schedule and his moods and his specific form of ambient threat. Those things do not switch off like a light. They power down gradually, over time, with the particular patience that is required for recovery from the kind of harm that leaves no visible marks. She knew all of this. She was not done, but the key was on her key ring. The account was in her name. The man she had married was sitting on the back steps with her son in his lap. This man who had not asked her whether she was sure, who had read every word she had written and believed it without condition. She was not done, but she was for the first time in 9 months not doing it alone. That was not everything, but it was in the September morning on the back steps with Joshua's hands buried in his father's shirt and the grass still wet from last night and the neighborhood waking up around them in its ordinary suburban way. It was enough to start with. It was enough.